We are live.
Greetings, everyone. I am Jasjeev Singh Sani from Delhi, India, and I would be moderating today's webinar. I welcome you all to the webinar organized by PeaceX on the topic Special Education Needs, the Roadmap for Inclusivity with Development. I hope you are all safe and are doing well. We earnestly hope that you find the session informative and learn new insights that all of us must have regarding the diversity among humans as well as the need of inclusive education. Before we commence, here's a brief introduction about PeaceX, what it is, and what it does. PeaceX is an international amity and peace organization that is working towards creating a more sustainable, inclusive, and responsible world. We bring together leaders, innovators, and change makers to achieve this and promote the sustainable development goals set by the UN. This is the third webinar for the 17 for 75 series being held by PeaceX. This entails talks and interactions with the 2020 class of young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on the Youth. Before we commence with the discussion, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Siena Arora to present PeaceX's first impact project. While it seems that there are some technical difficulties on Ms. Siena Arora's end, we'll continue with the discussion and we'll present our first impact project at the end of the webinar. Everyone, today's theme is an important one. It is special education needs, the roadmap for developmental inclusivity. There is a beautiful innate curiosity in the hearts of everyone in the world. The curiosity to know more about the world where we live in, and the curiosity to know more about the world inside us. This celestial diversity in our common humanity far supersedes the glow of our any other trait. However, not all of us get the chance to pursue where our curiosity takes us. Children with learning differences and disabilities may not find themselves in an environment that is conducive to their unique curiosities and abilities. They may be subjected to unequal treatment and exclusion from education standards suited to their needs. These challenges, compounded with an education system that may not always respect and value them with their quality education, is concerning to say the very least. Education for all must break barriers, those outside in the world and those inside within us. Inclusive education should foster understanding, acceptance, collaboration, tolerance, and generate openness towards others and towards their characteristics and diversity. On this note, I would like to introduce you to our very awesome and inspiring guest speaker, Ms. Siena Castellon. Ms. Siena Castellon is an 18-year-old neurodiversity advocate and author from Ireland who lives in the United Kingdom. She was recently inducted in the 2020 class of young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on the Youth. She is neurodiverse. She is autistic, dyslexic, and dyspraxic and has ADHD. Yet, that has not stopped her from achieving her goals and being very awesome and inspiring to all of us. When she was 13, she discovered that online resources were focused on supporting the parents of children with special education needs, or SEN. Sienna decided to address this by creating QLmentoring.com, also known as quantumleapmentoring.com, a website that supports SEN students. Most recently, Sienna launched her flagship Neurodiversity Celebration Week campaign, an international campaign that aims to challenge negative perceptions and stereotypes about autism and learning differences by encouraging schools to flip the narrative from focusing on the challenges of being neurodivergent to focusing on their strengths and talents. This uh, also led her to become the best-selling author of the Spectrum Girls Survival Guide: How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic. Sienna, your consistent work towards the advocacy on learning differences and inclusive education is an inspiration to me and others across the world. I am grateful to you for joining us today. Before we start with our discussion, I'd like to go over a few rules for our audience that we should all keep in mind throughout the duration of this live session. Please feel free to ask questions during the webinar through the live chat session. We'll try our best to take them up. I urge you to be kind, polite, and cordial when you write your questions. There is an attendance sheet for the webinar in the comment section. It's pinned to the top. Please fill out this to confirm your presence. The form will be open until 45 minutes after the session ends. Please note that e-certificates will be provided within 1 week to only those who fill the form. I would now like to commence with our amazing speaker, this discussion, which definitely is a need for the hour. Sienna, I'd like to begin with our first question, which is an overarching theme of what we're going to talk about today. Learning disabilities bring with them a set of unique challenges. What would you like to tell us about these, keeping in mind your own personal experience?
Thank you so much for that introduction. There are quite a few challenges, I would say, that come with learning differences. And when I was first diagnosed, I was only told about these challenges. When I got diagnosed with dyslexia, I wasn't told all the benefits. I was just told, oh, well, this means you're going to struggle with reading and you're going to struggle with spelling. And then when I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, a motor coordination disorder, I was told, oh, well, you're going to struggle with being clumsy and being uncoordinated. With ADHD, I was told you're going to struggle to pay attention. And with autism, I was told you're going to struggle to converse and because autism is a social communication and interaction disorder. So I was going to struggle to socially communicate. And I spent a lot of time thinking about all the negatives of these learning differences. And teachers would constantly tell me all the negatives. And it was a narrative that was really ingrained in me and ingrained in many other people who are neurodiverse. And after I had a summer vacation and I was really thinking about all of my differences and thinking about how they impacted me, I had this revelation that they're not all that negative. I personally, and this is something that has been tested in lockdown. Before lockdown, I believed that if I were stranded on a desert island and if I wasn't around any other people, I would have no problems with my learning differences. I wholeheartedly believed that. And then lockdown happened. And effectively, I was on my own without having to deal with other people and without having to deal with a world that wasn't suitable for my needs. And I had no problems. I'm dyslexic. I had no problems during lockdown. I just used spell check and that was it. I did not have to deal with, signing forms in front of people and messing up on spelling something. I didn't have to deal with being in class and being told, oh, go on the board and write this thing, and then me worrying about spelling it wrong in front of everybody. I just lived my life. And in lockdown, there was no anxiety around any of my issues. I honestly wouldn't have known that I had any disadvantages because I was so happy with not being, judged with my autism. Oftentimes in the real world, when I'm out and I'm on public transport and I'm living my life, I get quite a bit of anxiety because I have a sensory processing disorder that goes with autism. That means, for me, things are louder to me than they are to other people, and things are brighter to me than they are to other people. So I can get easily overwhelmed. And when I'm on public transport, there are times where I can get panic attacks because all the sensory information that I'm processing gets too much. But when I was in lockdown, I had none of those problems because I just lived my life the way I wanted to do it, and I reduced any sensory things that could cause me any anxiety. And so I had a great time, and I focused only on the benefits of my learning differences. I focused only on the fact that my dyslexia made me more creative and not on the fact that it hindered my spelling. I focused only on the fact that my autism gave me a different perception and helped me when it came to running events for my foundation. And I didn't focus on the fact that it hindered my social communication because I wasn't really communicating with people because I was in lockdown. And so it's been really great to just be thinking about all the positives of my learning difference and not focusing on all the negatives that are only brought to light by being in a world that isn't designed for people who are different.
That's definitely a beautiful narrative of seeing the bright side of it. And as you've put it forth, that during the lockdown, you got to test that it was society that was reinforcing some arbitrary social isolation, social barriers that were really sad and unfortunate. And that does bring me to my next question on the people with learning differences may be discriminated against and often be emotionally or physically bullied, and that is something that society and its perception reinforces, and not the beauty inside those with learning differences. How should society as a whole, according to you, work towards the elimination of this social isolation and social barriers that they may impose?
I think teaching people to be kind is really important. When I was at school, I was bullied not just by students, but by teachers as well. And it was ruthless. And, we would have classes on not bullying people, and people would come in and they would talk about, how you need to be accepting of everybody. And they'd focus on very little, like minute details, and they wouldn't focus on the bigger picture. And what I've found is you don't have to be an expert in autism, you don't have to be an expert in any learning difference to improve the life of someone who is different. I have gone to school, there have been teachers who have gone on courses and learned, in their eyes, everything there is to know about neurodiversity. And they've made my life very difficult by not giving me reasonable adjustments and by treating me unkindly. But then I've been in another class with a teacher who is just a kind person. And they may not know that much about autism. They may not know that much about dyslexia and dyspraxia. But when I go to them and ask them for reasonable adjustments, and when I go to them and tell them that I'm struggling in class because of a neurodiversity that I have, they listen to me and they support me out of kindness. And that's something that has really been beneficial in my life. And so I always say that in society, you don't have to have this whole focus on knowing the minutiae of learning differences and of the little minutiae of people who are different. I mean, that would be nice, but it's not necessary. You just have to be kind and you just have to be tolerant.
That's definitely something to take home with us. You just have to be kind and tolerant. And that, I think, does set the scope for much of what we are going to speak about today, of how people need to be kind with others. And that really makes a difference about how we perceive things about ourselves and how people perceive things about us. So, moving on to my next question, you've spoken a lot about a mismatch in the resources on learning differences that are available online. And even you have previously said that while there are support resources online for the parents of the children with learning differences, there are not many for those for the children themselves. How would this actually impact the way in which special needs children may become self-aware and know about themselves?
It definitely has an impact. I remember when I was diagnosed, I didn't really have a lot of information on my neurodiversity. I mean, I was given all these pamphlets, all these documents, but they didn't help me with the everyday details. I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I would go online and I would try to find resources because I wanted to find methods to help me pay attention in class, because I was having this problem where I just couldn't pay attention in class if the teacher wasn't teaching in a way that was conducive to my ADHD. And so I'm trying to find resources. And I find resources on how teachers can make their class ADHD friendly, how parents can, help their kids study with their homework in an ADHD friendly way. But it was all talking about how to adapt your lesson plan and how to adapt the way you were doing things to make it ADHD friendly. It wasn't talking about what do you do if the lesson plan is not ADHD friendly. How do you cope? And so there was all this information out there that just wasn't relevant to me, because I was reading about, oh, well, get your kids to stand up and move around in the classroom, and that'll help them pay attention. And then I'm sitting there like, well, I can't do that. I'm just going to get up and start walking around in the middle of a history class. Like, I'd get a detention. Like, that's not something that I have power to do. And so I was just trying to find all this help and all this advice, and I wasn't getting anything. And then, of course, I couldn't go to my teachers at school and ask them for advice because they knew even less than I did. And I couldn't go back to the person who diagnosed me because, you know, they're busy diagnosing other people, and they kind of cut ties with you the second that they hand you that paper saying you have ADHD. And so I was really lost. And I ended up, you know, trying to find all these resources online. There weren't any, so I created my own. And I've had the exact same story with every single learning difference I've been diagnosed with. And it's difficult because it reinforces that idea that you're the only person going through this. When I was diagnosed with autism, I felt really, really alone because I actually didn't know anybody who was autistic and a woman. I knew a few people who were autistic, but I couldn't relate to their experience because they had a very different type of autism than I did. And so I would go to school and I would be surrounded by people who just did not have the problems that I have. I wasn't born being able to read body language. Other people were. And so I'm having all these problems that people cannot even begin to relate to. And I know that, and I feel so alone because I'm the only person going through this. And if I talk about it to people, they're going to look at me like I have no idea what we're talking about. That's such a foreign idea to not be able to read body language and simple things like that. And so then when you go online and there's no advice for you, it reinforces that idea that you're the only person going through this, when in reality you're not. 20% of people are neurodiverse, and it's believed that 5% of the population are autistic. And so I have no idea why there are no resources, because 20% of people being diagnosed as being neurodiverse, that's a really high number when you think about the population as a whole. Odds are every single person knows someone who's neurodiverse, has someone in their family, has a friend, or they themselves are neurodiverse. And so I cannot wrap my head around the fact that there are a lack of resources.
Yeah, but this does give a perfect launchpad to us to talk about the amazing website you made when you were 13, quantumleapmentoring.com. What motivated you to work on that, and how has it impacted people's lives?
I just wanted to have a website that gave advice to children who had learning differences, not to Senkos, not to parents, but to children themselves. And I also wanted to create a central hub for information around all learning differences, because there is this idea that, you know, we're going to have the dyslexia website and then the ADHD website and then the autism website, and you separate all of them. And so if you're trying to find help, you're going to tons of different websites and you're trying to collate the little information that there is and spending all your time going from one organization to another trying to get help. And so I wanted to just have one central website, because a lot of people are comorbid. You know, I'm autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and have ADHD. And within the neurodiverse community, it is very common to have more than one neurodiversity. And so I wanted to reflect that in my website and talk about different neurodiversities. And when I first put it out, I got a lot of really positive feedback. And I had people saying that they'd never seen anything like it, and they were really happy that there are resources available. There were people who were happy that the information was relevant. I mean, that was one thing that I found when I was writing my book, A Spectrum Girl Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic. When I was writing it, I tried to find other guides that were similar, just so I could see what was already out there. And I was finding that there were these guides written by 40-year-old neurotypical men talking about autism in teenage girls. And they were no way are able to relate to our experience, but yet they're trying to give us help and advice around it. And I would read the book, and as someone who was autistic and a teen girl, I would realize that all this advice they were giving was pretty useless and was pretty out of touch with our experience. And the little advice that is out there, it's frequently from specialists in autism. And I think that you can study the medical side of autism, but you can't be an expert in autism if you're neurotypical. You need to truly understand it and live the experience. And so people giving advice when they're so far removed from the situation, it wasn't helpful. And so people were contacting me and saying, you are clearly living this to be able to give this advice. And people also appreciated that I was sharing my story and stopping people from feeling so alone and so isolated because they could read about someone who was going through a very similar situation.
Yeah, even when I was reading about this, it was quite alarming that even government websites and even websites that specialize on medical differences weren't really that, informative, and you couldn't really find one single source to that encompassed all of this knowledge. And quantum leap mentoring actually was one of my go-to sources for reading about most of this, and it was definitely a great way to website. So kudos to you, and it's definitely a great resource for reading about everything you want to know about and advice that people may want, which doesn't come from neurotypical men and is actually suited towards neurodiverse individuals themselves, and doesn't really read like a classroom plan or a government policy initiative. So yeah, definitely it's a lovely website and an amazing initiative.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So I'd like to move on to talk about the language that has a lasting impact on how we people feel about people and how people feel about themselves. And language has a strong part in that. And how do you think that the language that people use with and while talking about those with learning differences actually affects them? And what should one keep in mind while talking to them and while talking to neurodiverse individuals, or while talking about neurodiverse individuals?
I did a really great project with UCL, and it was called their Disability Service Project. And the aim of it was to try to get resources and to figure out what neurodiverse people at UCL needed help with and what kind of resources they needed. And so I helped to just research different things that people were saying. And so as part of that, we got laptops, we had a department set up. And while I was going through all of these documents talking about different ways you can support neurodiverse people at university, I found that there was this phenomenon of sorts where people would create a department and call it the Disability Service Department. And people with physical disabilities would happily go there and talk about their problems and the needs they need to have met. But people who were maybe dyslexic felt very stigmatized going in and saying, I'm disabled, I need help, because from their eyes, they didn't feel disabled. They felt like, well, I have a very mild problem with my spelling and I maybe need a laptop, but that's it. I don't want to go into a building with a big sign above the door that says disabled. And I could relate to that because, yes, I have differences that mean that I need some adjustments and I need a little help here and there, but I don't consider it this big disability and this big hindrance on my life because I'm empowered and I feel happy to be different. And so I think that a lot of people need to reflect that mentality in their language. And I make sure that whenever I talk about, I say learning differences. I don't say learning disabilities because in my eyes, it's not a disability, it's a difference. And so I think that that's a thing that's important to reflect when you talk about learning differences.
I think even quantum leap mentoring very well reflected that ethos of not calling it a disability per se, but calling it a learning difference, because it's just a unique ability and it's just a unique characteristic you have and not an actual uh, uh, disability. So I think you're very right when you characterize that. And that does bring me to my next question on neurodiversity and what it is really about. So it is really about the approach to learning and disability and differences that says diverse neurological conditions are a part and parcel of normal variations with humans. And that is something that you've been putting forth time and again. As a neurodiversity advocate, what would you like to tell our audience about neurodiversity and everything that surrounds it?
I would say that there's this very common idea of like, oh, we need to pathologize neurodiversity, especially in the autism community. People are so focused on what causes autism, and they want to know what causes it so they can prevent it or they can cure it. And I am constantly reading article after article of people who are investing billions of pounds into research to try to figure out how to cure autism. And I ultimately disagree with that mentality. I disagree with this pathologizing learning differences and pathologizing neurodiversities so that you can cure them and so that you can treat them like a disease. Because ultimately, the reason that we have, iPhones and a lot of technology and a lot of innovation that has happened is because of people who think differently. 60% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic. Richard Branson, dyslexic. If you look at the entertainment industry, Emma Watson has ADHD, Justin Bieber has ADHD, Justin Timberlake has ADHD, and all of them accredit their success to the fact that they think differently. When you're, creating music or creating a product and you're trying to make waves in the industry, it's important to be different to everyone else. And one of the ways to do that is to just think differently and perceive the world differently. And so if people go around and find a cure to autism and find a cure to dyslexia and a cure to ADHD, then we're going to end up in a world that doesn't have a lot of innovation and has people who think in very similar ways. And that's just going to stunt our progression. So I think it's very important to embrace neurodiversity and to empower people who are neurodiverse instead of just dismissing them.
Definitely, that is really some food for thought, and that does kind of make us think that why isn't neurodiversity, a mot de jour, a word that is used more and more, and something that people are more aware about, and that is something that I believe was a part of what led you to launch Neurodiversity Week. What exactly is Neurodiversity Week, and what would you like to tell our audiences about Neurodiversity Week?
So Neurodiversity Celebration Week is a week that I founded in 2018. And I wanted teachers to learn more about learning differences. I wanted students who are neurotypical to learn more about learning differences so that there's less stigma, less misconceptions, more understanding. And I wanted neurodiverse individuals to feel empowered because so often you're focusing on negatives. And I wanted to flip the narrative and focus on positives. And so in my week, there are posters that are put up around the school that show, successful people who are neurodiverse. There are activities that you can do, lesson plans, assemblies, and the whole week is set up around empowering people with learning differences and showing the positives of neurodiversity and also helping neurotypical people understand their neurodiverse peers. And I've had some really great feedback from it. There's one story that I always talk about, and it was a kid from Australia, and he had ADHD, and he was told his whole life that if you're not going to be able to pay attention for 5 minutes in class, how are you ever going to be able to work in an office? How are you ever going to be successful? How are you ever going to have a job? And he really internalized that, and he had really poor self-esteem, and he thought that he was going to be a failure in life. And he ended up having a lot of depression, and then the anxiety goes with that. And it really reduced his quality of life because he was constantly being told all the negatives of having ADHD. And then his school did my week. And during the week, he heard about all these famous people and all these incredibly successful people who have ADHD and talk about the positives of their ADHD and how it made them successful. And he then flipped that narrative in his head. And instead of thinking, ADHD is going to ruin my life, he thought, well, this could be really beneficial. And I'm really proud to have ADHD because it's going to make me different and it's going to make me successful. And so because of that, he no longer has that like low self-esteem, and he doesn't put himself down for having ADHD. He feels empowered by it. And that was a story that I was really happy to hear.
That's really a beautiful anecdote, and I believe that that is an incident and that is a pattern that's been happening all over after Neurodiversity Week has been launched. A Neurodiversity Celebration Week is most definitely something that should spread around all over the world, and it should really be something that educational institutions really take in their own curriculum plans and all. So, before going on to the next question, I would like to inform our participants that we now open the floor to send in questions. Please write your questions in the chat box, and we'll be asking the questions you all sent through the form. But due to the paucity of time, we may not be able to address all of them. Right. Moving on to myths and misconceptions. That has been a leitmotif of what QL mentoring has been about and what all your work has been about. That there are certain myths and misconceptions about people with learning differences. What would you like to talk about these, and which ones would you like to debunk?
There are so many myths. I could probably talk for days about the number of myths that have gone around. I'll start with ADHD. I was told, so I was diagnosed when I was 15 with ADHD, and I went to a teacher and I told her about how I had ADHD. I was newly diagnosed, and a few adjustments that I thought that I needed for class. And she immediately tells me ADHD does not exist. What ADHD is parents who don't know how to discipline their children, then feel embarrassed that their children are badly behaved, and they come up with a reason to explain this bad behavior so that they don't look like bad parents. And so they came up with ADHD. And I was shocked to hear this because that's like such a dismissive, ignorant thing to say. And you can see brain scans of people who have ADHD and see the physical difference in their brains. And you can put, for instance, I go on medication for my ADHD, and when I'm on the medication, I'm different and I think differently. And so that's a clear indicator that to begin with, something was different. And so it was so ignorant and it was so dismissive, and it was one of those things where I was putting myself out there to talk about my ADHD and to disclose the fact that I'd just been diagnosed. And she just had this misconception around it, and because of that, she didn't want to give me reasonable adjustments. She didn't want to give me support because she felt like I was badly behaved and my parents were embarrassed by me. So that was something that happened. Another thing that I get very frequently is you can't be a girl and be autistic. If you make eye contact, you can't be autistic. If you have facial expressions, you can't be autistic, which is shocking to me because there are so many women who are autistic. There's this idea that there are fewer women than men who are autistic. I genuinely believe that they're equal numbers. It's just women are less likely to get diagnosed. But there are very famous, like Temple Grandin, for instance. She's one of my idols, and she's a famous woman who's autistic. And so this idea that autism in women doesn't exist, it's very dismissive, and it means that people are less likely to get diagnosed with that kind of stigma and misconception going around. I also get told that, this is very common, everybody's a little bit dyslexic. Or I get told everybody's a little bit autistic. And they proceed to give an example about how they are a little bit dyslexic. So I was told everyone's a little dyslexic. I know that I'm a little bit dyslexic because this morning I misspelled a word. I'm like, everyone misspells a word, but that doesn't make you dyslexic. I'm misspelling my mother's maiden name that I've been, I've known her maiden name for like 18 years and I'm still misspelling it. I'm misspelling the road that I grew up on. Like, that's dyslexia. Dyslexia isn't misspelling a word that's not phonetic, that you've never spelled before. People say everyone's a little bit autistic and then give an example about how they misunderstood a social situation. That's not what autism is. Autism is like, having a social communication and interaction disorder that means that you can't read body language and that you find it difficult to present in a way that everyone else does. When I was growing up, I couldn't make eye contact. And it took me years to train myself to make eye contact. And so when people say, oh, I'm a little bit autistic because, I have a bit of a weird smile, I have no patience for it. But when I was diagnosed, I was shocked by the amount of misconceptions that go around. And I'm also shocked by the amount of confidence people have when they explain their misconceptions, because in reality, you just have to pick up one book on autism to know that girls can have autism. You just have to pick up one book on ADHD to know that ADHD exists. And so these people who say with such confidence, their misconceptions, I find it shocking.
Definitely. And it's definitely a starting reality that even these misconceptions exist in a day and age where we have the internet and we do have information right at the palm of our hands. But therein lies the element wherein misinformation goes along with information. And people may have some inherent characteristics about themselves which may not lead them to believe those informations. And that is really a sad reality. And yeah, so definitely. And let's move on to the next question, which is about twice exceptional students and their unique experiences. Twice exceptional students, or 2E students, are students who are both gifted and have learning differences, but they are often misdiagnosed and misunderstood, and hence become disillusioned about the learning process itself. What do you want to say about the problems and plights that they may face, as well as the way in which we can identify potentials of these students?
Yeah. So, this is also mixed in with misconceptions that people have. I went to school and there was an experience I had where I'd been diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia, and because of that, I was eligible for extra time. And so my parents send all this paperwork into the school for me to get my adjustments and get extra time. And the teacher immediately says, she can't have extra time. That's not allowed because she's a smart kid. Extra time is meant for people who are dumb. And so it's unfair that she's top of the class and getting extra time when there are people at the bottom of the class who are getting lower grades than her who aren't getting that. And then she proceeded to say that I have an unfair advantage because I have extra time. And I found that quite bizarre. And it was a misunderstanding in what extra time is for. Extra time is they take you as someone who has a neurodiversity and they think, what would they be like if they didn't have a neurodiversity? Okay, let's try to get them to that level. And so for me, I'm dyspraxic. And it means that I write slower than I would if I weren't dyspraxic. And so if you give me an hour, I will probably not finish a test because I'm writing slower. But if I'm not dyspraxic, I'd easily finish that test in an hour. And so extra time is just giving me that little bit more time so that I can get the same score as I would if I weren't dyspraxic, so that I can have more time to finish the test like I would have if I didn't write slower. That's what extra time is. Extra time isn't, let's try to get this person to be way better than everyone else. Let's try to, that's not what it's about. It's about comparing you to your potential and what you could be doing. And so because of that, I was denied extra time. There were other scenarios where teachers would say, oh, well, she doesn't need reasonable adjustments because she's doing well in the class. This idea that neurodiversity is just for people at the bottom of the class, which is something that's very judgmental and very ignorant, because Einstein was neurodiverse. Isaac Newton was neurodiverse. You can be incredibly intelligent, you can be a genius and be neurodiverse, and you can still need a little bit of support here and there.
Yeah. And that is definitely something that we should keep in our minds. And let's move on to the economic relation of all that we've spoken about so far. What additional complexities may children with learning differences who are from less economically privileged backgrounds face?
So in the UK, we have something called the NHS, and through it you can get diagnosed with learning differences. And so when it first came out that, I think I had a teacher who said, I think that Siena might have dyslexia. My mom, read about it And she'd actually thought that I was dyslexic years prior. She thought I was dyslexic when I was 4 years old, but a teacher said she can't be dyslexic because she's kind of reading. And so she didn't get me diagnosed then. And then when I was 10, when a teacher brought it up, she thought, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Siena's dyslexic. So she tried to get me diagnosed through the system in the UK, where it's free. It's part of the National Healthcare Service. And my mom was told, you're going to have to wait 2 to 3 years. And immediately, my mom was like, well, we can't do that because she needs extra time now. I had very important exams coming up. And if I didn't have extra time for those exams, I wasn't going to be able to get into a good school. And that was going to affect, my future and how I was going to do academically, for years to come. And so my mom decided to pay for me to get diagnosed. And because of that, I got my dyslexia diagnosis and I got my extra time. And immediately my grades went up. And because my grades were going up, my confidence went up because I was spending the same amount of time and energy studying for exams and I was getting low grades. And then all of a sudden with my extra time, my grades increased. And so I no longer felt like I'm wasting all this time working. I no longer felt like everything I was doing was, for nothing because my hard work wasn't reflected in the grades I was achieving. And teachers no longer called me stupid and teachers no longer called me lazy for misspelling things because before they didn't understand why my spelling was so bad because I could read. And so they would tell me that I was lazy and that stopped because of my diagnosis. And so immediately I was doing better in school, I was more confident and I was happier. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been diagnosed. And every single time that I've been diagnosed, I was diagnosed privately because waiting 2 to 3 years would have been really disruptive, especially with my autism diagnosis. When I was 12, I had really bad mental health because I was being bullied effectively for symptoms of my autism. People would call me a freak and a weirdo because they thought I was robotic. And people wouldn't make friends with me and they would call me all these awful names. And teachers would say, well, it's her fault she's being bullied. If she didn't want to be bullied, then she would act like the other kids. As if I was purposely acting differently so that I could be bullied because I wanted to be bullied. It was so bizarre to me, but they refused to help me. And so my mom got me diagnosed. And when I was diagnosed, I got help. And, the school realized that what was happening now was a disability hate crime. When you bully someone for being disabled, that's a hate crime. It's not just like fun bullying that happens. And so things changed. And that was all because I was diagnosed. And I'm always, I'm incredibly grateful that my mom made the sacrifices she had to make economically to find the money to get me diagnosed. Because had she not, I would probably be sitting here right now, still on a waiting list to get diagnosed and still wondering why I'm so different.
That is definitely a touching story, and definitely economics is something that does come in the way of how people get diagnosed and get misdiagnosed, and that in itself does affect our perception of people. And let's move on to how the elephant in the room right now, which has well confined us in our rooms, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the medium, efficiency and reach of SEN facilities.
Yeah, COVID has been really something. I mean, I'm very lucky in that I was able to socially distance. I was able to do all of my work online. And there are some people who aren't as fortunate and who have to go outside and who have to do in-person work, and that causes all sorts of problems with it in and of itself. When COVID first hit, I remember hearing all these stories from people in the disabled community who were talking about how they were no longer able to get nurses to visit their home. How before they weren't able to go to the stores because they had a physical disability. And so they would get food delivered to their home. But now that everyone's socially distancing, everybody's getting food delivered to their home. And so the delivery services were telling them, we can't send you food anymore. And so now they're in this situation where they're not physically able to go to the stores and carry all their grocery bags home. So they're just sitting at home with no means of getting food because their nurses aren't coming either. And so they're in this really difficult situation where they're essentially like starving, trapped in their home, which was an awful story to hear. And there were hundreds of people who were having similar experiences. And it was really like shocking and quite distressing to hear. And I'm, really lucky that, I didn't have those problems, but there are definitely people who are less fortunate who are really struggling, in the wake of the pandemic. I mean, there are people who aren't able to wear masks, who are being, turned away from stores because of that, because people aren't accepting that there are some differences you can have that mean that, with respiratory voice you can't wear a mask, and people aren't accepting of that. And there are a lot of problems and misconceptions going around. Also right now, my sister, she's autistic, and she also has a few physical disabilities that mean that she's really high risk for COVID. And her school told her, you have to come in. If you don't come into school, then you're going to get in trouble for it. Everybody has to come to school. You can't socially distance. And so my sister is now in a school environment where right now you're not allowed to have gatherings of more than 6 people, which I find really funny because I joke with her. So you can sit in a classroom with 20 other kids. You can sit in a lunch call with 50 other kids. But if 6 of you decide to leave, that's wrong. Even though you're spending all your time together. And there's no social distance happening in a school. I mean, that's not how schools work. They just pack you into a room. And so she's having a lot of anxiety that goes with that, because she's really worried that she's going to get COVID and that she's going to have all these health problems that go alongside it. And the school isn't understanding of that. I mean, there are a lot of problems that are happening right now and a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions, and it's really difficult.
Yeah, COVID-19 has, I believe, exposed some of the things which were inherent yet invisible in our social systems. And they were already existing, but COVID-19 has sort of brought them to the surface. And I believe that I do agree with you wholeheartedly that there is some kind of a privilege that we can chat and sit on a laptop while there are others who are genuinely suffering, and without even being afflicted from COVID, they are suffering from pre-existing problems in our society itself. And that does bring me to sustainable development goals, which have been touted as a way of uh, obliterating these inherent inequalities in our society. So according to you, how does quality education for all, which is the fourth sustainable development goal, relate to special needs education as well as inclusive education as a whole?
So right now, I focus on what's going on in the UK. There are so many people who are being turned away from education in the UK. I mean, and I've heard stories that are honestly just insane. There was, one story of a child who had ADHD, and the school told his parents he cannot come in to the school building unless he is on ADHD medication. And the parents said, well, we don't want to put him on medication because there are a lot of health effects that go alongside ADHD meds. And as someone who has ADHD and occasionally takes meds, I'm completely aware of the problems that come with taking meds. And I have to be very careful when I take them because I can get very sick if I take them too many in a row. I have to take maybe 2 meds a week because if I take them every single day, I get really sick. And so there was just this restriction, and so that meant that he could not go to school. There are so many people who are also forced out of education, and not in the same way, not in the we will bar you from the school gates if you come in without meds, but for me, I was told that I shouldn't be in mainstream education because I was having panic attacks because the school wasn't, making reasonable adjustments that I needed. I had schools who frequently told me, you shouldn't be here because you're having problems and you're not like everyone else. And so there were times when my mom had to pull me out of school and homeschool me. And there's so many people who just need very small adjustments to make school livable. I mean, for me, I just needed to not go to assembly and not go to the lunch hall. Those are the 2 things I needed. because I would go to the lunch hall and it was just too crowded for me, and the smell of the food would kick off a sensory processing attack, and so I'd have like a panic attack just from thinking about going to the lunch hall. But with the school, they were like, everyone has to go have lunch. And I would say, well, maybe I could just bring my packed lunch and just eat it in a classroom. Everybody has to go to the lunch hall. And so I would be walked into the cafeteria, and then I'd have to sit down, and I couldn't eat anything because I'm like so stressed out. And so I'm just sitting there with a plate of food in front of me, just like counting the seconds down. But that was a rule they had. And if I said, can I just have this reasonable adjustment? Why do you think you're different? Why do you think rules don't apply to you? No, I think rules still apply to me. I'm just asking for a very reasonable adjustment. Oh, well, no, you're just such a drama queen and you just need to figure it out. And then they would make me go to assemblies. And the thing with assemblies is I went to a school that had 3,000 people, and they had a big auditorium, and they would have around like 1,500, half of the whole school in this auditorium. And you would have to walk in through 2 doors. So 1,500 people would go in and out through 2 doors. I mean, granted, they were big doors, but you have the idea of the amount of pushing and shoving that would happen. And so I would say, can I just show up late? Can I just show up when everyone's gone through the doors? No, if you show up late, you're going to get attention. So I'm there and I'm having a panic attack because every morning you have to do this assembly. And so that would stress me out. And then for the rest of the day, I would be stressed out. And it eventually starts to wear off. But then you remember that you have to have lunch. And so then I'm thinking about lunch, and then I get stressed out, and the whole thing. And it meant that I had a lot of anxiety over 2 very simple, reasonable adjustments that I needed. And because of that, I was essentially forced out of this school. And people think like, oh, well, it's fine. I mean, the school, they can do whatever they want to do. But in reality, it meant that that education was no longer accessible to me. And it was only through, my mom homeschooling me, looking at tons of other schools and having to join schools mid-year and having to deal with all of that I got an education. And when I graduated, over the summer. I was so happy that I've been able to do that because I didn't think it was going to happen. I thought that I was going to have to drop out and just figure it out by myself. And that's coming from someone who didn't have any academic difficulties. I mean, I got into Imperial College. The only reason that I was struggling in school was because they weren't making reasonable adjustments for me, and they weren't taking into consideration the fact that I was autistic. And so it is so important to make education accessible to all so that people can, learn.
Definitely. And us neurotypicals think that school is difficult for us, yet it's been made in a way that us neurotypicals can study. And it's neurodiverse people are often neglected in such school systems, and it's really moving that such incidents are still happening in the 21st century. And it does reinforce the need for fundamental human right of education as something that should be adopted everywhere without contestation. And I believe that you've very succinctly spoken about that. And yeah, and you've been mentioning a lot about your mom as well, and kudos to your mom and parents all over the world who've actually been working to bridge the gap between the learning differences that their children may face and the entrenched inequalities that our education systems might have. And kudos to parents all over the world who've been working for that. And yeah, so let's move on to talking a bit about numbers. And you've spoken that 20% of the people around the world may know another neurodiverse person. And relatedly, there's a statistic that says that 10% of the population actually faces some degree and form of learning difficulty and a disability. Yet the conventional education system has been built in such a way that it caters to those only without those who don't have those differences. Why do you think that such a disproportionate treatment is still entrenched? Why haven't we made the change?
I think that it's just because people don't care. It is very easy to bully people out of education, and it is very easy to make it an individual problem. I mean, I remember being at school and being told that there was something wrong with me, and I was different, and I was a problem, and I was difficult. And I didn't know it, but there were 3 or 4 other people in my year who were being told the exact same thing. And the school wasn't reflecting and thinking, oh, well, what are we doing wrong? They were just looking at it as these 4 kids have a problem and they can't be taught. And there's nothing that we can do to help them. And so we just have to sit here and tell them they're wrong and dismiss them. And that's a good system because look, everyone else in the class is fine. And it's kind of, it's heartbreaking that people have that mentality when it comes to students in their class. And so often you hear it all the time with ADHD. Kids who can't pay attention in the school environment are told, like what that kid in Australia was told, how are you ever going to be successful since you have ADHD? How are you ever going to hold down a job? You have something that's wrong with you. Look at everybody else in the class. They don't have the problems you're having. They're sitting down. What is wrong with you? And when you make it an individual problem as a school, you can then say, well, we're really good at educating kids because 80% of our kids are fine. It's just these 20 kids who have something wrong with them. And so that's the mentality they have. And very rarely have I gone to a school where they look at it and say, wait, how come every year there are like 4 or 5 kids who really struggle? Maybe it's us. And then they try to create a system that means that those 5 kids don't struggle. That's a really rare thus to take. It's just so frequently, it's just blame kids who are different.
It's really blaming the kids, and that entire blame game is something that shouldn't really be played by schools who are literally shaping the lives of so many people. And yeah, and we'll move on to the questions given by our participants and in the live chat. And the first question has been asked by Ms Pavni Gupta, who asks, what made you embrace the differences that are surely making you bloom others' lives and your own?
I just really thought about the way it impacted me. And, at the beginning, I talked about what I would be like if I were on a desert island or what I would be like if I weren't around other people. And when I was first diagnosed, I really thought about that. And I found that the only problems I was having was problems at school. I mean, with my dyslexia, when I'm at home and I'm, writing an article or when I'm, just living my life outside of the school environment, I don't have any dyslexia or anxiety. I don't have any problems with my dyslexia because I can just use spell check and that's fine. And with my dyspraxia, yeah, I'm clumsy. But I mean, it hasn't affected me at all. The only time my dyspraxia affects me is when I'm in a sports class.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now I live my life so that I'm not doing netball and I'm not doing hockey and I'm not doing like gymnastics or whatever stuff they made me do at school. I just, wake up and I go to my laptop and I do my work and I do my podcasts and then that's that. And so being clumsy, it doesn't affect my life because I'm not, doing activities that I know I'm going to be bad at. And with, my autism, I've just learned to live my life in a way that is autism friendly and friendly for all of my neurodiversities. And when I do that, I only have the positives. I don't have any of the negatives. And so through living my life that way and making the adjustments that I needed to make, I realized that the positives really do outweigh the negatives.
I'm sure that does motivate others who may feel that their differences are actually, restricting them and not a beautiful part of themselves. And that is something that you've put forth very well. And yeah, I'd like to move on to the next question by Carissa Mai Vasquez, I hope I'm pronouncing the name well, who asked that what message do you have for those who suffered from depression because of the discrimination they encountered owing to neural or other disorders?
I would say really think about where the depression is coming from. I've been in that environment where, I've been bullied at school. And because I'm being bullied and because I'm being told all these negative things, I end up getting anxiety and the anxiety leads to depression. And I'm, focusing on all this abuse that I'm getting in the school environment. And I have no idea how I'm going to recover from it. And I'm going to therapy and nothing's really working. And then I leave the school and all of a sudden the depression's gone because I'm no longer getting that source. I'm no longer getting told constantly that I'm unsatisfactory. I'm no longer getting told constantly that I'm a freak and a weirdo. And that was what was causing the depression. And so once I leave and once I'm in a happy environment when I'm supported and praised, I'm no longer having that effect on my mental health. And so really thinking about where it's coming from and how you can reduce the impact of it. I mean, people would tell me when I was at school, when I was being bullied, and people would say mean things to me, well, you should just ignore it. You just shouldn't let it bother you. And I find that that is the most unhelpful advice ever, because it's always going to bother you. I mean, no matter what people say, no matter how empowered you are, it's always just going to be unpleasant to hear. I mean, I don't think you can ever get to a point where your self-esteem is so high that when people say hateful, critical things, it brushes right over you and you don't even recognize it. I mean, it's always going to be there. And so you just have to find a way to cut all those people out of your life, or just reduce, the exposure that you have to whatever is causing that depression.
Yeah. I'll move on to my next question, which is about technologies. And what technologies do you think can be adopted by educators to facilitate the learning process for those with learning differences?
I think that different technologies work for neurodiversities. Um, I don't know what it's called, but there's a pen that you can get. I thought it was so awesome, where you move it along, a line of text, and it will read the text out to you. And I thought that was amazing. And there are all these people who use that, and you can get, you can use it in exams if you have the right paperwork for it. And if an educational psychologist says that you need it, you can use it in exams, and people find it really helpful. And I would have found it really helpful because I would frequently misread the question. I remember one time I did a history exam and I got 50%. I was horrified. I was like, how did I get 50%? Well, I read it. And it turned out that they asked me to write an essay, and they gave me a time period to write the essay on. And I wrote the essay on a completely different time period. That was it. They were asking me about like what was the cause of World War I or something, and I wrote about World War II. And of course, I got no marks for it because I was answering a different question. And the reason that I'd, misread the question was because of my dyslexia, and I'd read it multiple times. It was just that, that's just how my dyslexia works. I just misread stuff all the time. But I think that if I'd had it read out to me and I'd heard it, like if it were auditory, I think that I'd have understood what the question was saying and I wouldn't have answered something completely different. And so that pen's really helpful. Also, spell check is amazing. I use a system called Grammarly, and it's basically, it's kind of like spell check, but a step above it. And so it does grammar and it does punctuation and it does all of that. And so there are times when I'll write an article and I'll think it looks good, and then I'll put it through Grammarly, and they highlight all of the kind of mistakes they're making. And then at the top, they tell you how many mistakes you made. And I wrote this article that I thought was pretty good grammar-wise. And it turns out that I made like 40 mistakes in this thing because I was misusing commas, I was spelling things wrong. I have a thing where I always misspell dyslexia because dyslexia isn't dyslexia friendly. And so that was really helpful. And yeah, I mean, you just research things and you find things that work for you, because there's some tech that I've heard of that I've tried to integrate into my life, like Dragon Dictate is something where you talk into a microphone and then it writes it out. And I thought that was going to be helpful, but it didn't work for me. And so you've just got to experiment with different things.
Yeah, and some of the technologies that you've spoken about really sound like they're out of a sci-fi film or sci-fi movie, and it's really amazing that such technologies exist. And really, the need of the hour is to make these technologies accessible. And even I have had some very cool personal experiences with Grammarly, and it's definitely a lifesaver. And yeah, and we have been talking. That'll be, I think, a perfect pivot to my next question, movies and all, to how well represented are individuals with learning or cognitive differences in popular media, movies, TV shows, and books?
I would say they're not well represented at all. I mean, it depends what you mean by well represented. They're definitely not 20% of people in all movies that are neurodiverse, but a lot of the time you'll have an autistic character, and the depiction of autism will be for comedic effect. The depiction of autism will be, wrong, or it'll be based on a very specific stereotype, like Sheldon Rain Man kind of thing. One thing that really bothers me is frequently you'll have someone in Atypical. Atypical is a TV show where the main character is autistic, and they kind of talk about the struggles that the family has since they have an autistic son, and it focuses on his problems in high school and all of that. And the character is played by someone who is neurotypical. And I feel like that was a real loss of opportunity, because you could have gotten an autistic character who has experience with autism and who can present it in a way that is reflective of what it's really like. I mean, if you get me, I mean, I'm not a good actress, but if you get me to play an autistic person, I think that I would understand the role more than someone who's neurotypical. And I know that with acting, it's all about trying to get into a role, and it doesn't have to be, reflective of your experience. But when you're depicting something like autism that is so rarely shown in media, it's important to get it right, because so many people are going to look at that character and think that is what autism is. If I see someone like that, they must be autistic. They're going to look at that character, and that's going to be all the information they know about autism. And so if you get it wrong, there's going to be a lot of misconceptions and stigma that's going to come from that. And so it's important to get that balance right. And so I think that that's not really done commonly.
Yeah, I think representation in itself is the first key to change how people who are neurodiverse may feel about themselves. And casting neurotypical people in neurodiverse roles is something that needs to stop, because as you said, it does misconstrue the characterization of how people feel about themselves. So yeah, moving on to specifically how female students with learning disabilities may feel about themselves. And you said that they have a different treatment than how people with autism who are boys may feel. And you've spoken about how females, there is a chasm of representation, not only in terms of neurodiverse and neurotypical, but also in terms of male and female. So how do you think that pans out?
I think that when I was growing up, I had, my parents would look back with hindsight once they really understood autism, and there were people in my class who were autistic like me. I remember when I was in nursery school, there was someone in my class who was autistic, and he was a boy. And he was treated completely differently to the way I was treated, both before anybody knew that we were autistic. I remember I would have panic attacks over clothing. I would have panic attacks over the lights. When you're 4 years old, people are very loud, and I would have panic attacks over kids shouting. And I was told, you're a drama queen, you're a diva. And my parents would constantly be told how I was attention seeking and how I would cry at the drop of a hat, and how I was always just having these temper tantrums, and how I would say that I didn't want anybody to touch me because I thought it was fun, and I thought it would, like, they came up with these narratives, and I was always told that I was a diva and a drama queen. But when a boy had the exact same panic attacks, and when he would freak out over stuff like that, he wasn't told that he was a drama queen. It was, oh my God, what caused it? Because if a boy cries about something, I mean, it's got to be serious. I mean, there's got to be a reason. And so they would be like, so they had conversations with his parents talking about how, I think there's something wrong. I think that you should get him tested. And so he was diagnosed when he was 5. I was diagnosed when I was 12. And when I was growing up, I wouldn't make eye contact. And teachers would say, you have to make eye contact. And I remember I went to a school where every morning you had to walk in and you had to shake the headmistress's hand. And what would happen is I would go in and I would shake her hand, and I would get stressed out because she was holding my hand and I didn't like to be touched. And because I was stressed out, it was really difficult for me to make eye contact, because already I struggle with it, but when I'm stressed, it's even something else. And so she would say, you're not allowed to walk by unless you look me in the eye and shake my hand and say good morning. And so you had to do three things: say good morning, shake her hand, look her in the eye. And I would struggle with every single one of them. And I'd hold the whole line up. And so people would be like, can you just say good morning? And I would be there and I would be stuttering and I wouldn't say good morning loud enough. And I wouldn't look her in the eye with enough confidence. And every morning it was a whole production. And people would be really annoyed if they had to stand behind me in line, because it would, no joke, take me 3 minutes to shake the headmistress's hand and say good morning. And because she was so stern with me, and because I was like disciplined in that way, I learned how to make eye contact. And it took me years, but I figured it out. And it was because there was so much societal pressure. And when I was younger, I didn't really have facial expressions. I would just have a resting face. And if I was excited, this is what I would look like. And if I was sad, this is what I would look like. I wouldn't really emote. And people would say, you've got to smile more. Why aren't you smiling? And I was constantly told I needed to smile more. And so I figured out how to do that. And I would make facial expressions even when I didn't really understand why I was making them and I didn't quite get it, but I just knew that people wanted me to do it, so I did it. And all this pressure was put on me to act like everyone else. Whereas the boys who were autistic, they didn't have that same pressure and they weren't disciplined in that way. And so it meant that I learned to mask and I presented differently, and it took me way longer to get diagnosed.
Yeah, right. Uh, it's really that some neurotypical made institutions that are just taken for granted are just averse of how people who are not neurotypical might feel about them, and they really just take their own institutions and idiosyncrasies for granted, and it's just something that we need to think about and work upon as a society itself. Sienna, this will be my last question, and it's something that we've been covering a lot, and we do want to summarize it for our audience. So, how do you think uh, what should we keep in mind while facing issues like these, both as a neurotypical people and neurodiverse people? And what line of advice would you like to give the youngsters out there who want to make a change?
I would say if you are neurotypical or if you're it's very important to just be kind. I've talked about that before, but that's the best thing you can do, and it's the most supportive thing to do. And if people come to you and they ask you for help, just be kind and be tolerant and be respectful of them. If you want to advocate, I would say it's very important to talk about your experience and to talk about your story. I think that's part of the reason why, I've become successful as an advocate, because every single thing that I'm talking about, I've experienced and I'm dealing with. I'm not talking about neurodiversity from the perspective of someone who's neurotypical, who doesn't know what it's like to be neurodiverse. I'm talking about it from the perspective of someone who's been neurodiverse for 18 years and has lived it and breathed it and struggled through the whole thing. And, just be kind, be tolerant when you're doing your advocacy, and there are going to be people who are going to dismiss you and to just ignore them, block them, move on. I've gotten a lot of criticism for, not being autistic enough. People come up to me afterwards and they'll say all that stuff like, oh, you're just pretending to be autistic because girls can't be autistic. You just ignore it. One thing that's really helped me with my advocacy is utilizing social media. I have a Twitter account, I have a LinkedIn account, I have an Instagram account, and it means that I can reach out to people, across the globe, and I can, get my message out. I have a platform to talk from, and so I would definitely recommend getting on all the sites and finding people who are doing similar things to you and collaborating and reaching out to them.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can really imbibe from all this conversation, is that being kind is really is what makes us us. It compels the society to think better of themselves and think better of those who they interact with. And I think being kind is really how we should would be the first step to empathize on other people's problems. And yeah, it's definitely been an insightful and invigorating talking to you, and it's been an amazing conversation. And before we conclude our webinar, as promised, we'd be commencing with I'd be giving the floor to Ms. Siena Arora to present PeaceX's first impact project. Over to you, Siena.
Thank you so much, Jasjeev. Thank you so much, Sienna, for taking our time for the webinar. Um, Here's the announcement for everybody out there. While you sit on your laptop or the phone that you're holding right now and light up your neurons with the invigorations of education and Sienna's insights that were really helpful, we would like to extend an opportunity to you to aid in spreading this light of education to the people who live beyond the access of technology, which in this age and time is very, very important. On this International Day for Eradication of Poverty, we urge you to play your part in eradicating learning poverty and to join us for an adventure where learning is a two-way process for those who live in poverty struck conditions and for those who can learn their bit from them. Here, we at PeaceX present to you Project Bookpecker. To contribute your bit, please visit our website www.thepeacex.com. You can either apply as a volunteer to make the content that will be spreading out and in turn to collate this content, or as a fellow to join the League of Learners who help others learn. You can also collaborate with us for disseminating this content across your nation and the world. Moreover, you can also donate a device or devices that can be refurbished or are new, because this will significantly help the poverty struck people out there. The applications will be live on Monday. You can contact us if you have any queries on our email info@thepeacex.com, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn for updates. Here's a cheers to all the change makers out there who will help us and people like Sienna to spread the requisite awareness that is required at this point of time. Thank you so much, Jasjeev, and thank you again, Sienna. Loved to hear you.
Thank you, Senior. And now, as we conclude our webinar, I'd like to thank our guest speaker, Ms. Siena Castellon, for taking out time from her busy schedule to be with us here today and share her most valuable insights. We'd like to also thank all our participants for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. I would now like all PSEX members to switch on their cameras for a group photograph. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for making PSEX's webinar a success. We hope you stay safe, be kind to everyone, and take care. Thank you so much.